Hey Film Buffs, welcome back to Film Feature 43. I just got back from watching Uncharted and I kind of wanted to give my 2 cents on it. The reason that I picked this movie to talk about over other things that I've seen recently is after getting out of the movie, I looked at Rotten Tomatoes to kind of see what other people thought about it, and critics said that it sucked and it should be a 39%, and fans said that it should be an 86%. So I kind of wanted to give my 2 cents on where on that scale that I think it lands, because that's a pretty big gap. There are going to be spoilers. I'm going to try to keep them light. Also, I'm going to talk about the bad first and then the good, so there's going to be time codes that you can click to get to one or the other. You guys know how YouTube works. So let's get into talking about the good, the bad, the ugly of Uncharted. So on that scale of 39 to 86, clearly that can change. It's a brand new movie. Something could happen. A lot of people could say it sucks and drop that score, or some critics could jump in and say it's good. But I think it's closer to the fan score. I would give it a 70%. It wasn't a flawless film by any means. It wasn't even the best film that I've seen in the last couple months, but it was kind of a fun romp, and if you got 2 hours to kill and you want something fun to watch where you can turn your brain off and just enjoy it, I think it's a good choice. Now, there clearly was some flaws overall, especially since I gave it a 70%. The first big one that I had was the pacing. The movie felt like it was rushing to get from one set piece to the other, to one clue to the other. Like, it was kind of afraid to linger on one idea too long. A good example is when Tom Holland's character is confronted with this adventure and he says no, which happens in almost every movie, and then right away, pretty much on the same night, he comes back and says, yeah, I'll join. They don't really linger on one idea or one kind of notion too long. It's almost like they were afraid that they had too much content to fit into 2 hours, so they kind of rushed it and pushed it. Keep going, keep going, keep going. Keep that pace up. And maybe they didn't want to make anything boring. They didn't want to have a lull in the action, which I'm guilty of complaining about in other movies. And I didn't feel that way. I actually felt more rushed than I did bored, if that makes sense. Now, a side effect of it being rushed, at least to me, was there was some clunky dialogue that went along with it, and it wasn't just the humorous aspects where in a movie they'll tell a joke and it'll fall flat and feel clunky. A lot of even the scenes that were supposed to be tense had this dialogue that didn't really sound natural to me anyway. I think the movie did come into its own more so when there was less dialogue and more action. To kind of fill those gaps. You weren't having that clunky dialogue to pull you out of the story. But one bad thing whenever it came to the action, whenever it was the fighting and the choreography of the fighting, it was really well done. I think the parkour stuff really played well in this movie, but when you got to the CGI aspects of it, a lot of it left something to be desired. It actually kind of gave me a headache, some of the in-the-air stuff that we saw in the commercials and things like that. Really kind of made my head hurt. It just was too much going on at one time, and the CGI really wasn't the best. It could also be that I sat in the second row, was leaning back a little bit, because the theater that I went to was actually packed, which surprised me. I didn't know that this was going to be such a big movie for my area. I guess a lot of people like Tom Holland. Some of the camera work too was kind of odd. There were a lot of close-ups. One scene in particular between Tom Holland and Mark Wahlberg really reminded me of the scene from The Expendables where they zoom in on Mickey Rourke's face really closely. That kind of camera work happened a few times throughout this film. There was one scene in particular where they were really close. It kind of looked like this. Like I said before, there was some humor in this.
I shouldn't have come out to play with the big boys, Ian, because you're about to get a proper Scottish welcome.
What? I think about 50-50 it landed with me. They did a lot of Mark Wahlberg is old jokes in this.
A little young for a bartender, aren't you?
A little old for prom, aren't you?
Which struck me as odd, and not because Mark Wahlberg's only 50, but one minute they were telling jokes about how old Mark Wahlberg is, and then they were kind of alluding to the fact that he hooked up with the 2 lead females who were both 26, so there's kind of a weird disconnect there with, hey, you're really old, and also you got with these 2 girls. I mean, Mark Wahlberg is a good-looking guy, and I know age is just a number and all that, but it just kind of was a weird disconnect of the old jokes versus the Bond-esque sleeping around with the Bond girls type stuff that was going on. That's it for the bad. I want to get to what made this movie enjoyable, and for me, the biggest selling point for this movie was the cast. Marky Mark was good. I really liked him in this. I like him in most things that he's in. If he's good enough for Scorsese, he's good enough for you. Overall, it's exactly what you'd expect from Mark Wahlberg, the kind of schmarmy, sarcastic character that he plays a lot in his movies. Tom Holland, likewise, is kind of the kid who's out of his element, but actually knows what he's talking about a lot of the time, and it really shines through Holland's acting ability. You don't really think of him as Spider-Man, being that that's his only role that he's had really up until this point, at least big name role. He kind of steps away from that. Yeah, it's still kind of actiony, but he does get to display more of his acting ability. Not that No Way Home, he didn't really get to put that on display as well. I know that I described the two female leads as kind of these Bond girl-esque leads whenever I was making an observation about Mark Wahlberg sleeping with them, but overall, that's not true of these two leads. Sophie Ali and Tati Gabrielle did an extremely good job in this movie. I didn't recognize them from anything, and being the villain and being the kind of love interest that you can't really trust, it was believable to me whenever they were on screen. I could actually kind of feel the tension whenever they were there, and they held their own in this movie against their male counterparts. I think specifically in this day and age where we talk a lot about strong female leads, these two are a good example of that, because it wasn't pointed out that, hey, they're women, they can't do the same things that we can. Never once did the men underestimate them in this movie. Tati Gabrielle was the leader of this assassin mercenary group throughout the entire movie, and not once did anybody ever think of crossing her. And Mark Wahlberg slammed her through a glass window. So if that doesn't scream equality, I don't know what does. I think I could talk about how well these two ladies did all day. I was very impressed overall with their performance because I didn't know who they were going into this movie, and they made me sit up and take notice to their performances, being someone who I didn't know before. I went in expecting a good performance from Mark Wahlberg and Tom Holland because I knew who they were. I didn't know these two girls, and I think their performance rivaled Holland's and Wahlberg's, at least in my opinion. And the last casting choice I really praise is Antonio Banderas as the kind of first bad guy we get in the movie. It's always good to see Antonio Banderas on screen. I liked him since I've seen him in Spy Kids. I think he's a pretty good actor. He did well in this film as well. Never disappointed to see him on screen. He rounded out the cast kind of as a whole with the pluses that I talked about before. I think he was a good kind of throw in for them to have as a bad guy in Act 1. Overall, I thought it was a fun flick to kind of go and see, just to burn some time. If you want something that's entertaining, and like I said, you can turn your brain off and watch it, it's definitely worth a watch in that regard. I don't know how it compares to the video games. I've never played the Uncharted video games, so I don't know how well story-wise or how well dialogue-wise or however you want to compare the video games to adventure-wise. I don't know how that stacks up. Like I said, I've never played the games, but if you got 2 hours to kill, I think it's a good movie. You could pick a worse movie to go watch. I know that's not a glowing endorsement, but it's also not a 39%. So if you've seen it, let me know what you thought of it. They really teased a sequel in this, and I think that that's a possibility, especially seeing how packed my theater was in the small area that I lived in. There might have been more people in there than was watching Spider-Man on the opening night, which really surprised me, because I watched it at 4:30, and I watched the Spider-Man movie at 4:30, and I think there were more people tonight than there were at that one. I also watched Scream on opening night, and there wasn't nearly that many people. So, I mean, at least in this area, it looks good for it to get a sequel. I would go and watch it, but let me know what you guys thought. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.